This been great so far, hasn't it? It's been the Lord has really been blessing us with a lot of youth, a lot of young people, and it is awesome to see them participating in service, their willingness to do so, and I want to thank you all for doing that. And that's the theme really of what we're going to talk about this morning, that we do not have to wait until we're older and grown up to serve God, right? We saw it this morning, and we're going to look at the life of a king of Judah named Josiah. When he was 8 years old, made a huge impact on his people and on the nation that he was king over. And before we do that, though, it's going to be useful for us to look a little bit further back in his genealogy, in his pedigree. We're actually going to start with the life of his grandfather, a guy named Manasseh. And we can read about him in 2 Chronicles chapter 33. If you want to turn there, these will also be up on the slides. But I want to do that to give a little bit of context to see what Josiah's exposure to God was before he made the decisions that he did. And we're going to find this actually pretty remarkable. Let's go back now. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 33. We go to the first slide. It'll be on there. Well, I forgot about this timeline. You can look at it real quick. Manasseh had a son named Amon, who had a son named Josiah. Josiah is the one we're going to be focused on the most today, but the point is that I wanted to bring out with this, you see, that's a long time ago, 695 BC. And what we find, though, is although the world was a little bit different then, and there was things that they experienced that we don't really know a lot about, people are people. And the principles that we read about in the Bible and the things that the people wrestled with and the problems that they faced, even though they look different culturally, at the core and root, they're the same. And it's really important for us to grasp that. It's so easy for us to go, yeah, I was back in Bible times. Well, no. People are people, right? And the principles at play in the Scriptures and God working with and through people, they're just as relevant for us right now as they were then, okay? So with that said, we'll go on and we'll read from 2 Chronicles, beginning in chapter 33, verse 1. It says, Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. Now let's let that sink in just a little bit. 12 years old. It's not very old. We have some 12-year-olds in this room, I think. I know we got at least one because she's my daughter. And I think we got a couple more. 12 years old is not very old. Think about that. A 12-year-old comes to the throne when he became king. And he reigned in Jerusalem for 55 years. Long-time king. How was his life summarized? The epitaph of his life. How was it described? Verse 2. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Now, I want to stop and comment on that. You know, when they talk in the Bible about these kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, that was the nation that God had chosen to be His people, to be a blessing to the world around them. These kings were supposed to honor God and lead the nation to do the same thing. That was their job, was to ensure true worship of God, to make sure the people knew God, and to be a leader and example in that way. And they would sum up their reign in one sentence. Either he did evil or he did good. And the summary of this guy Manasseh's life is he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And he did the practices of the nations that the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Verse 3, he rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had demolished. Now what a high place is the worship of these pagan gods took place on hilltops or on mountains, because they had this idea that, hey, that's closer to heaven, closer to God, or gods in their case. So they'd make sacrifices and worship there. His father, Manasseh's father Hezekiah, tore a bunch of those down because he's like, this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing that. Well, Manasseh, as soon as he got the chance and the power to do so, put them back. These places of the worship of foreign gods, he had them put back. It says that he also erected altars to the Baals. Those were the gods of the Canaanites. And he made Asherah poles. Asherah was a goddess, and they would erect these pillars that pointed straight up and do acts of worship around these poles. He was reinstituting pagan worship, ignoring the God of Israel, worshiping the gods of the world around him. He bowed down to all the starry hosts, and he worshiped them. Verse 4, he built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, my name will remain in Jerusalem forever. In both courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry hosts. Now let's think about that for a second. Not only was he worshiping other gods and building these high places and erecting these poles, he went into the temple of the God of Israel, and he turned it into a pagan temple. The temple was viewed as the house and the throne of God. He went into God's house and he desecrated it by setting up altars, worshiping other gods, the nations around him. He's not on a good roll, is he? He's a pretty bad dude. And what's worse is it gets worse. Look at the very next verse, what it says about him. How bad had things gotten in his life? Verse 6, he sacrificed his children in the fire in the valley of Ben-Hinnom. He was so deep in this pagan and idol worship that his fatherly love and affection for his children was overridden, and he would sacrifice their life to worship these gods. And he would burn them in fires to give glory to these awful, detestable, wicked demon gods of these foreign nations. He practiced divination and witchcraft. He sought omens and consulted mediums and spiritists. In the next sentence after that, it sums up God's view of it. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. You think? God, if you didn't already know this, if you're new to the whole Bible church thing, God can get mad. And God gets mad when you worship other gods, not because he's some egotistical jerk, but because he knows, since he made everything, he's the best that there is. He knows he's the only one that can give life that's worth having. And he knows when you run after these other gods, your children get burned up in fires. He knows that you are oppressed, you are imprisoned, you are enslaved to these other powers, and they cannot give life. So God says, don't go after them. But Manasseh did with all his heart. And he gave up his children in the process. And God saw this, and he saw that he was leading Israel astray, which is the next verse. We go to the next verse. We look at this. It says that this verse 9, he led Judah and the people of Jerusalem astray so that they did more evil than the nations that the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. It wasn't just him and his family, the whole nation, since he was king. He was leading them down a path of self-destruction. And it aroused the anger of the Lord. And God's like, look, man, you got a job. It's to represent me to the people so you all can be a shining light to these nations. And instead, you are living out these wicked things that the nations were doing. It's why I judged them. Why are you doing the same thing? And this is Josiah's grandpa. But here's the thing, and I wanted to make mention of this. Let's go on to the next section of verses. This is verse 10. God didn't give up on Manasseh, even though he was a not very nice man. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. God kept calling, so hey, come, repent, turn back to me. But they would not listen. So, 11. So the Lord brought against him the army commanders of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh prisoner, put a hook in his nose, that's literal, put a hook in his nose, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. The Assyrians were in this habit. They were wicked, terrible, bad nation. Brutal, violent. When they conquered a nation to demonstrate their power, they would take literal hooks, hook them through the jaw or through the nose of the king and drag them back to Babylon. That's what they did to Manasseh. Judgment was brought upon him for his wickedness. But then, check out what happens after that. in his distress, this is verse 12, he sought the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. Now, some of us, we may be a little slow to learn lessons, right? I'm a little slow in the uptake. Sometimes I got to mess up a few times before I get it right. But this dude was just ridiculous, okay? This is a whole new level of being slow to learn. But finally, when he's in bronze shackles, hooking his nose, drugged back to Babylon, he's finally submitted enough to I have messed up. These gods got me nowhere. And he humbled himself before the God of Israel, the God of his fathers. And one of the most remarkable verses in the book of 2 Chronicles comes right after that. And when he prayed to him, the Lord was moved by his entreaty and listened to his plea. And so he brought him back to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord is God. Now, this isn't the main focus of the message this morning, but it's deeply important because there may be somebody in this position. This guy messed up his whole life, and he was really deep in, both feet in, evil all the way, running away from God. It took a hook in his nose, bronze shackles, being a prisoner to come to a point of submission. But when he called out to God, in spite of all that, God was moved and heard his prayer. That is the God that we worship. And we worship him because he is a God of that deep love and grace and mercy. He was angry. Don't get me wrong. He didn't just close his eyes to sin. He brought judgment, a real judgment, tangible judgment. But that judgment was put in place to try to turn hearts to him, and it worked. And when that heart was turned, even that whole life of messing up, God heard his entreaty. And at the end of his life, after all of that, God was rich enough in grace and mercy and love that he heard him and accepted that call, that appeal. There's a really huge lesson in that twofold. One, it's never too late. If you're at a place in your life and you've got stuff and you're like, I'll just wait till later to make a decision. Well, don't do that. But realize it doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter how much you've messed up. It doesn't matter how far from God you have been at any point. When you are humbled and you finally admit that God is God and he's here to save you, he will hear you. Call upon his name today. It's never too late. You can't get too far. You can't get too dirty. You can't get too messed up for God to say, no, too bad. When we call out to God, he hears. And that is huge. And we cannot miss that. The other side, if that is God's patience, what does that say that we as God's people should be like? Let's think about that a little bit. There's people we pray for years. There's people, they start coming to church, but they're still messed up because we don't get perfect and then come to church and never mess up again. If you think you do, you're wrong. You're a liar. Okay? We're all in the same boat. Sinners saved by grace and a work in progress. If God shows that amount of patience, we have to invest in others with patience also. God is our pattern for everything. Jesus showed us that when he showed up. God didn't give up on Manasseh. Whoever our Manasseh is, let's patiently and lovingly continue to try to call them back to God, because who knows, it might work. But here's the thing that is most relevant for what we're talking about this morning. This was Josiah's grandfather. He did come to God later in life, but his entire life was marked by the sentence that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He was killing his kids. What impact do you think that had on his surviving son, Amon? We go to the next slide. We introduce King Amon. This is Josiah's dad. Sure, his father came to God towards the end of his life. Sure, his father did humble himself. But the influence that was from his father to him was one that was largely, almost completely negative. I mean, his siblings had been killed in a fire being offered to God. So this near-deathbed confession of his father was not going to have a very deep impact on his life. And because of that, even though Manasseh did change towards the ends of life, the impact he had on his son was one that was not in a good direction. This is the paragraph we read about King Amon. This is all the information we have about him. Amon was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 2 years. How was his life summed up? Verse 22, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as his father Manasseh had done. Amon worshipped and offered sacrifices to all the idols Manasseh had made. But unlike his father Manasseh, he did not humble himself before the Lord. Amon increased his guilt. Amon's officials conspired against him and assassinated him in his palace. Then the people of the land killed all who had plotted against King Amon, and they made Josiah, his son, king in his place. That's a very short, very concrete, to the point statement about his life. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but he didn't humble himself like his father did. He worshiped his father's gods. That was the influence that he stuck with. And instead of departing from it, he just kept going deeper and deeper. He increased his wickedness. Now, here's why that's important. We're about to look at King Josiah. This was his father, his dad. We heard about his grandfather. Yeah, he had a late in life confession, but his life was marked by doing evil and worshiping the wrong thing. And his father, marked by evil and even worse, did the wrong thing. But then we get to King Josiah, the third one down the line. And listen to what it says about him. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. 8 years old. Is that not a frightening thing to think about? 8 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. Now listen to the summation of his life. Read it with me. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. We'll stop there. And followed the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. What example did he have to go by? Apparently his protectors that were there, they didn't just turn an 8-year-old loose on the throne. He had protectors and he had guides. And he had the wisdom, though, to listen to the ones that were pointing him back to the God that he knew was the God of his ancestors. He's like, wait a second. I see what this pagan worship did to my grandfather. He ended up with a nose piercing. Not a cool one, but a really, really bad one, okay? And I saw what happened to my dad. He got killed after 2 years. These gods are worthless and useless. I need the real God. And so he listened and he learned and he pursued. He was a cycle breaker. You know, we get in habits as people, we even use these kinds of terms sometimes and talk about people this way. Sometimes certain actions, behaviors, and demeanors are associated with a family. You know what I'm saying? We might be like, oh, you know, they're a Smith. They're just all bad temper. I just made that up. I'm not talking about any particular Smiths. I just saw him and said Smith, all right? Pretend Smiths in the land of make-believe that don't exist, all right? They're Smiths. They got a bad attitude. We expect that from them. Or, hey, pardon me. How embarrassing. It won't be the last time. And we're like, hey, they're from this family. You know what they're like, or they're from this family. They're all a bunch of drunks, or they're a bunch. We do that. We don't want to admit it, but y'all have heard stuff like that, haven't you? It does not have to be that way, and Josiah shows us that. He comes from a long line of screw-ups, idol worshipers, pagans, and he's like, enough's enough. I'm going to break the cycle. I've seen what hurt this has done to my family, and things will be different with me. Cycles can be broken by the grace of God. And Josiah brings that about. Let's keep reading about his experience and what he was like. In the 8th year of his reign, this next sentence is really important. While he was still young, he began to seek the God of his father David. While he was still young. How often do we get a culture in our church is, I'm not saying horse pasture in particular, I'm just saying the way that we think as a culture, kids got their place and it's over there. And when they grow up, well, then they can come and help us do stuff over here. And they can participate. They can help lead worship. They can do ministry then. And we should let them be part a little bit, but not like a full-fledged part, because they're kids, right? We don't mean to think that way, but so often we do. We get this air of professionalism in the church. Like, hey, we've got to do things, and if the kids, they may mess it up. They're loud, they're obnoxious, they screw up, say wrong. I do that, and y'all put up with me, right? we got to get this point, while he was still young. That's what we're going to keep hitting on that, while he was still young. It says that he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of all those high places and all of the Asherah poles and all of the idols. Look at verse 4. Under his direction, the altars of the Baals were torn down. He cut to pieces the incense altars that were above him and smashed the Asherah poles and the idols. These he broke to pieces and scattered over the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He burned the bones of the priests on their altars, and so he purged Judah and Jerusalem. In the towns of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and in the ruins around them, he tore down the altars and the Asherah poles and crushed the idols to powder, and he cut to pieces all the incense altars throughout Israel. Then he went back to Jerusalem. He meant business. He said, hey, if I'm going to follow the true God, I am all in. There's no halfway stuff. There's no syncretism where, yeah, I got God in my pocket, but then I got these other guys to cover my bases. It was no God and money, God and prestige, God and a bunch of wives and horses and an army. It was God. He understood what this commitment was about. And he said, I'm going to eliminate from my life, from my kingdom, any trace of these gods that were worshipped that led things down the path that my father and grandfather did. I am all in. And he did this at a young age. Look at verse 8. In the 18th year of Josiah's reign, to purify the land and the temple, he sent Shaphan, son of Azaliah, and Manasseh, the ruler of the city, and Joah, the son of Joahaz, the recorder, to repair the temple of the Lord his God. Things had gotten so bad that the temple was neglected, that there wasn't even an active priesthood to keep the temple up. This was the place where they're supposed to offer sacrifices and supposed to worship God and to go to cover their sins and to have these times of worship. It was the center of their life and their relationship with God, and it was so neglected that it was in disrepair and it had to be repaired. The only work that had been done on it was setting up altars to other gods. He got those altars out and he began a rebuilding project, and he said, we are going to worship the only God that matters. And look what happens as they are building back the temple. Look at verse 14. While they were bringing out the money that had been taken into the temple of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord that had been given through Moses. The book of the law of the Lord that had been given through Moses. That's God's law. The words of the covenant that he gave to Moses, where he told Israel, I have created you through Abraham. I have made promises and covenants with you. I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. Then he saved them from Egypt. He brought them through the wilderness. He put them in the promised land. He was with David. He had made all these covenants to be with his people. And he said, you've got to be faithful. You are my people. You are in my family. You are with me. Most of them hadn't even heard this story because the book of the law that described this was hidden in the temple that they weren't using. For generations, the Israelites hadn't even heard who God was with any great accuracy, let alone what he had done. They had these vague pictures of God and what he might be like. And that's what Josiah responded to. He's like, I got to get back to worshiping the real God. So he made these reforms. He got rid of the gods. He built back the temple. But then they find this scroll that has Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy on it. He brings it out. And then they realize what it is. And that launches a whole huge reform. Because they're like, hey, we have neglected the covenant our God made with us. We've turned our back. We've been running around on him. Look at this next passage of Scripture. This is amazing. Verse 20. Now this is crazy when we really let it sink in what happened here. Verse 29. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of the Lord with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the Levites. Levites were a priestly family. All the people from the least to the greatest, and he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. How dedicated was Josiah to getting back to God and living for and honoring Him? How dedicated were these people to get back to following God? He stood up and read Genesis through Deuteronomy, all of it, and they listened. What if I say, okay, you know what we're going to do for service today? Stand up. In the beginning, and I just go. For 7 or 8 hours, we get into Leviticus, and the priest shall take the blood and sprinkle it on the altar, and then dip his finger in it and put it on his earlobe. And you're like, you know? All of it. Because Josiah said, if we are following God, we're all in. No more of this compromise. Let's get back to worshiping God and following His covenant and caring about what He says. Do we care that much about what God says? It's a legitimate question for us to think about. So often, well, I don't read the Bible, I don't like to read. These people have been without God's scriptures for generations, and when they hear it, they're so starved for the Word of God that they stand and listen to Him read the 5 arguably most boring books of the Bible, okay? Because they came from God. And by the way, those books are only boring when we don't seek to understand what they mean for us. They got it. Because Josiah got it. And by example, he drew them into the presence of God to hear His Word, to worship Him, and to be wholly, completely, in every way dedicated. No, God and God all the way. Next passage of Scripture. Then the king stood by the pillar, and he renewed the covenant. The covenant that they had forgotten for all those years, he said, we're in. We rededicate, God. We're coming back to You. We know we've messed up. We know we focused on the wrong thing. We've ignored Your law. We've ignored Your worship. We have ran all over the place, but God, we're back. And he made a commitment to follow God with everything that he had in accordance with the words written in the book. And the next verse we're going to look at. Yeah, that one right there. Yeah. 30, I couldn't remember what number it was. Verse 33, there at the end of it. I mean, he got rid of all the idols. He got back to exclusively worshiping God. It says, as long as he lived, they did not fail to follow the Lord, the God of their ancestors. While he was still young, he began to seek the Lord his God. And look at the effect that this young 8 to 16-year-old boy had on this kingdom that was so far from God. They had lost touch with their God. They had quit worshiping their God. They maybe wore the name. Yeah, we're Jews. But they had completely neglected God. And God used this 8-year-old king, turned 16-year-old king, while he was still young, to launch this reform that brought them to their knees before their Creator and their Master and their God, and caused them to recommit their lives to Him. All this being true, there's a couple of things I want to challenge us with to be thinking. They come from 2 different angles. Last slide has our 2 challenges on it, because we're dealing with 2 different age groups. The first one, for those of us that are older, for those of us that are no longer 16 or 8, I'm in that group too, all right? If you're younger, if you are older, we got to ask ourselves, hey, what is it that we are doing to allow the younger generation to be used by God? Are we blocking off places in church saying, ours, no kids allowed? Well, we know what Jesus thinks about it. Remember, the early followers of Jesus tried that, and Jesus is like, he rebuked them. Rebuke isn't like, can you please let the kids come? I mean, he was hacked off. He's like, let the kids come to me. You can't even come into the kingdom unless you become like a child. Remember that whole thing? Talked about it before. We got to be careful not to say, okay, no kids allowed. God can use anybody. And this generation that is above the kids, whatever generation you fall in above that, we got to ask ourselves, are we making space for Josiahs to rise up in our church family here at Horse Pasture? Are we making space for them to use their talents and their gifts to express their faith? Because if we're not, we got to do some serious soul searching. We got to make that happen. And then beyond the life of our church, What are we doing to equip? What step can we take in pointing the next generation to Jesus? If we got kids, what's one step we can take? Well, should we start a family devotion reading the Bible? Should we start praying together? Whatever you do, think of one more step. If you've got nieces, nephews, kids, grandkids, maybe you don't have any of those. Maybe God's put it on your heart, like maybe I should help out teach. Maybe I should do a Sunday school class. Maybe I should sit in a Sunday school class so that a teacher can teach and not have to fuss at kids that act like kids, Who knows? But all of us have a step that we can take to help the next generation be in a better position. We want to make sure we are not Manasseh and Amon. We want to make 100% sure that we are giving them space and pointing them right direction and helping them thrive in their faith. Because here's the thing. I don't plan on living forever. I mean, not here. In heaven I do. I need to be careful how I say that. I do, but not here. Y'all with me on that? There's a lot better places to spend eternity. When we're gone and we're in glory, they're leading everything that goes on. They're already part of the church right now. And the more space we give them to help us gain our footing and give us the trajectory of how we reach, they know way more about reaching the next generation than we do. We got to give them that space to do that. What steps can we take to point the next generation to Jesus? Next one, if you're younger, here's the thing I want to leave for you to think about. Get active in your faith now. So often, and you can talk with a lot of us older people, there's this error that happens where you're like, hey, I got all this time when I'm young to fool around, focus on what I want, do what I want to do, sow my wild oats and all that, and then I'll do like Manasseh did, By the time that I'm older, I'll just change and I'll come to God later, and that's what I'll do. I'll have my time, then later give God His time. Look how that worked out for Manasseh. It was horrible. Look what impact it had on his son, Amon. Look what impact it had on the nation he was supposed to influence. Look at the widespread rippling of hurt and of pain, of ignoring God's call for all of those years. When we think, I'm going to just wait. We don't ever know we got time for one and for two. A lot of messed up stuff can happen in that time. Live for God now. Josiah, when he was young, while he was still young, made far-reaching impact. This is your church family just the same as mine, just the same as is your parents, your grandparents, and everybody else. And whatever God's calling you to do if you're young, do it. Be open to it. We see all through Scripture God using young people to do powerful things for those of us who have grown old enough that we don't like to listen. Because it's true. The older we get, the less we like to listen. Is that not true? Or maybe we just can't hear as good. I don't know. But the point is, very often God has used the young to breathe refreshed life into the church, to point us in the right direction, sometimes give us a little prod to keep going when we are so content to sit and be comfortable. The younger generation, they won't let us do that. That's why we need to give them space to do what God called them to do. What steps can we take to help the next generation get closer to Jesus? Get active in your faith now if you're younger. We're about to sing a song. It's meant to be a song of decision. And in this time of decision, just think about these challenges that were offered, but then there's one other one. If you're not already a follower of Jesus, here's the thing I want to leave you with. This song is sung to give time. If somebody needs to make a decision, come forward and make that decision. It could be that there's somebody here that they've been wrestling with God for a while, and they're finally at a place where I need to be all in, like Josiah was. I need to quit being like this King Manasseh and running after all these other things. I don't need to wait for a hook in my nose and shackles on my wrists. I need to come to God now. Today is the day of salvation. God calls and says, come. Don't wait for tomorrow. If you are at a place where you have not made a decision to follow Jesus, you have not called upon God's name, you've not turned your heart completely to Him, you've not joined Him in baptism to be sealed with Him, to be washed, come forward and make this decision as we sing this song. Let's go ahead and stand and sing this song together.